It's actually a very old practice when you think about it, but at the end of the day, it's risk. And so it can feel really risky to implement something so different. It's been around for thousands of years, but it is kind of new again in the US, right?
In this episode of Voices from the Field, NCAT Sustainable Agriculture Specialist Katherine sits down with Silvopasture Specialist Delie Wilkens to talk about Silvopasture. It's an agroforestry practice integrating trees, forage, and the grazing of livestock. Fewer than 1% of farms in the U.S. uses silvopasture, Delie says, although she sees it gaining popularity in the future. Katherine and Delie discuss the benefits, applications, and considerations surrounding silvopasture adoption in the U.S., and Delie shares advice for how to design, implement, and manage silvopasture systems and what things to keep in mind before beginning a silvopasture enterprise. Let's listen.
Hey there, I'm Katherine. I'm a Sustainable Ag Specialist with the National Center for Appropriate Technology out here in California. And today I'm sitting down to talk about silvopasture with my dear friend Delie Wilkens, who happens to be a silvopasture enthusiast. Hey, Delie.
Hello, everyone.
Delie currently serves as the program analyst for the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities, which is a nonprofit organization that works to advance the health and vitality of the nation's working forests and forest-reliant communities. Prior to her current role, Delie worked as a research fellow with the U.S. Forest Service at the Southern Research Station on several projects related to sustainable forestry initiatives. And Delie holds a Master of Science degree from Virginia Tech in Forest Resources, where she conducted research on the barriers to silvopasture adoption in Virginia and assessing the viability of different silvopasture treatments based on tree stocking density. She also served as an agriculture and forestry extensionist in Paraguay during her Peace Corps service. And that's actually where I met Delie. She and I were both down there for Peace Corps, and we were both working on agroforestry initiatives. So we were good friends there. And then after Paraguay, we both went on to get our masters in fields related to agroforestry. So we've been working together for a while now, and we've been friends for years. And so, Delie, I am just so excited to be here with you. I truly just love any chance I get to talk with you. So this is a true treat for me.
Oh, Katherine, it's always wonderful to talk to you. So I'm happy to be here.
So today we're going to be talking about silvopasture. And for those of us who aren't familiar with the term, can you just explain what silvopasture means?
Sure. Yeah. So silvopasture is just trees and livestock in a managed system. So there's a lot of different trees you can use. There's a lot of different types of livestock, but the key word here is managed. It needs to be a managed system.
So silvopasture is just one of the many agroforestry practices that are out there. Others include windbreaks and alley cropping and many, many more. So I guess just taking a step back for those who aren't familiar with the term agroforestry, what even is agroforestry?
Yeah, it's just an intentional incorporation of trees into an agricultural system, whether that's a cropping system or a livestock system, of course. And my graduate school advisor would kill me. He would be fuming if I didn't also emphasize the 4 I's. So in order for something to be called agroforestry, it has to be intentional, it has to be intensive, it has to be integrated, and it has to be interactive.
The 4 I's. Love it. I'm so glad you brought that up. That was day 1 of Intro to Agroforestry class in grad school. So important. And it really is important. Like you said, you have to be intentional about any agroforestry system that you're implementing, and it's going to be intensive. You got to manage it. So yeah, very, very important. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, there's 5 categories that are kind of widely used throughout the US in temperate systems. But obviously, we'll be talking about silvopasture specifically today.
Well, that's great for context. So thank you for that. I want to know what got you interested in agroforestry originally?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I grew up on a farm. It was about 80 acres, and about 20 of that was a dairy goat farm. And then the other 60 was just woods that we really didn't do too much with. And you'll see that a lot in especially the southeastern United States, which is where I'm from southwestern Virginia. So I've always loved agriculture. I've always loved trees. I've always loved all of that kind of stuff. And I've kind of gone a winding way through my career and stuff like that, but kind of always keeping that top of mind. And then, of course, when I joined the Peace Corps after my undergrad, that's when I first really heard the word agroforestry and first heard the word silvopasture. And we learned all the basic techniques to it. And I kind of fell in love with it in Paraguay. And I just kept going with it. Silvopasture kind of fell into my lap in terms of graduate school, but it made a lot of sense for my background. So I kind of kept going with it.
I love that your childhood farm had such an impact on you. And then you got to go on and actually learn about like the science of it all. And then Paraguay, yeah, I mean, that's really where I fell in love with agroforestry too, because yeah, like we were down there, we were actually working with farmers and seeing it in action, and just seeing like what an incredible and tangible solution that agroforestry could be, right?
And Latin America is just such a kind of a great place to see it too, because there are so many of those systems. It's very different than the US, but it was a really cool place to kind of get that practical experience with it too.
Totally. I fully agree. Thinking about silvopasture, it's this theoretical concept, but what does it actually look like on the ground? I know silvopasture takes so many forms, but let's just paint a picture of what it can look like, especially here in the US. Because like you said, it can take so many forms and it would be different in tropical systems. But what does it look like here?
So you are totally right. It looks different in different places. And I will just say, I grew up in the Southeast. I live in the Southeast. And so that is my bias in my system, but it can look a lot of different ways. And so in the southeastern United States, we see a lot of cattle specifically, and a lot of that is with hardwood trees. You like to have it with beneficial trees like a black walnut where you can harvest the nuts, or honey locust where you can harvest those little pods as well. But there's a lot of tree species that are beneficial to grow, whether it's food or to harvest the trees themselves, you can do that. And then there's a lot of other animals to have. And again, that can be for dairy, that can be for meat. And so it can look so many different ways. You can thin out your already existing forest and kind of run your cattle under it, or your goats or your sheep, or even your chickens. Some people do pigs. That's a big thing in the Southeast as well. Or you can have an already existing pasture and you can plant trees in it. Those have different kind of considerations as well. And then of course there's orchards where you can kind of run your trees through as well. Those are the different ways it can look like, and they all kind of have these different considerations to them.
Yeah, okay. So the important thing to remember is that a silvopasture system has to have an animal component, a tree component, and a pasture component. But beyond that, you can kind of arrange all three of those elements in lots of different ways, and it can look a lot of different ways.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, out here in California, we have some folks who rotate animals under their orchards. It's kind of more common, I guess, out here. But yeah, like you can do rotations of animals too, right? Like where you can rotate sheep through, and then pigs through, and then turkeys through, and then ducks through, and then chickens through, or whatever. Yeah, there are so many different ways to do it. It doesn't have to just be one animal in one system.
I think the biggest thing, and of course there's a bunch of resources to kind of help, because silvopasture can look so many different ways, right? But I think the biggest consideration is making sure that the animal that you have is right for that kind of microclimate you have, and making sure that the trees are right for that system as well. So a lot of it is really knowing your own land, right? And knowing your objectives to your land, and then figuring it out from there. And for your area, what's the best way to make money? Because this is an economic consideration as well. But yeah, there's a bunch of different ways to do it. It's really cool, which is why I love digging into it. Because like you said, we don't really have chicken silvopasture too much out here in a formal sense, but you see it all the time, and it can be really cool. And doing it in a more managed way is obviously beneficial as well.
Yeah, so I guess going off that, there's so many ways that you can design a silvopasture system, and there's so many forms that it can take, but it does have to be managed. There are things that silvopasture is not, right? Like silvopasture would not be, just a few trees, like one or two trees in a pasture, or just letting your cows loose in a forest. That also would not be considered silvopasture. So yeah, can you talk a little bit about like what silvopasture is not, and why that would be?
Yeah, essentially it comes down to those 4 eyes, right? Just running your cattle through your woods, that's not very intentional, and it can cause a lot of harm to the trees as well. And honestly, depending on the system, it can be a little dangerous to whatever animal it is as well. So just having an intention behind it and making sure that it kind of makes sense for the woods. Obviously, with planting those or having those 1 or 2 trees in the pasture, while it might provide a little bit of shade for your cattle or whatever it is, it also really, really compacts the soil around that area. It makes them kind of huddle up into one area, right? And of course, it's bad for that tree too. That tree's probably not going to be very healthy. It's probably not going to live for very long. And so, yeah, those aren't the greatest systems going for sure. And so that's why there are a lot of people who kind of say they do silvopasture, but it's not really silvopasture until you really take the time to manage it in a sustainable way for the pasture, for whatever livestock it is, and for the trees.
Right. So just emphasizing the importance of managing all three of those elements, the animal component, the forage component, and then the tree component, so that they're all in balance. And so what are the benefits of having all three of these elements together in a single system? What are the benefits of silvopasture over just regular animal husbandry? What are the economic benefits that you've seen? What are some of the social benefits? And what are the environmental benefits?
Yeah, very important to recognize the benefits, right? Increased yield is one thing that can be kind of obvious, but it can also be really important to understand that. This wasn't a podcast, I'd show you guys a graph, but I will try to explain this as best I can. Imagine you have a stand of trees, whatever it is, so mostly hardwoods or maybe mixed with a few pine species or whatever. You could get a great harvest out of those stand of trees. But with a silvopasture system, you might have to thin some of those trees out, right, in order for the grass to grow enough for goats or cattle or whatever it is to graze underneath. But you also have milk or whatever, or meat as a yield now. So the yield is increased, but it's two different yields. And so that's important to recognize. It does diversify your revenue streams. It diversifies your farm. So that's one huge benefit, is just that increased yield to it.
Right, because you're maximizing your vertical space. And so your whole farm yield is going to be increased.
Yeah, and there's a couple of other kind of things. There's some studies out there that kind of say, the dairy cows can produce more milk if they're kind of in that really well-managed system. The cows can grow faster as well. There's improved pasture fertility, nutrient cycling, things like that. If you kind of do this right, there's less flooding, there's less runoff, there's a less erosion in terms of the pasture and things like that. I know you guys are in California, but one really important thing for silvopasture, specifically in the Southeast US, that's a big consideration here, is just the well-being of your cattle. I know that's important everywhere, but here we have this issue with, it's called Kentucky 41 or tall fescue. It's what's planted out here for pasture. And it was planted like crazy, and now it's the dominant pasture grass you'll see. But the huge issue with it is it actually has a fungus that the cows ingest, and it causes like a heat stress. So silvopasture systems are enormously beneficial because it provides that obvious shade for cattle. And as a side note, that's why you always see cattle kind of heading for creeks and stuff, which is why a lot of programs have tried to, get you to fence off from the creek.
Wow, that is so interesting. I really did not know that was an issue. So yeah, it definitely makes sense that silvopasture is kind of an urgent issue then to protect animals from heat stress. And then what about cold stress too?
Yeah, so in addition to protecting animals from heat stress, silvopasture can protect animals from cold stress too. So whether that's providing animals shelter from snow or rain or wind or whatever, the trees protect the animals from the element. And that's actually been shown to reduce calf mortality and actually help cattle gain weight faster.
Yeah, and that's a huge benefit, not only just for the well-being of your animals, because we care about the well-being of our animals, but also just from an economic perspective. Being able to reduce calf mortality and then being able to get your animals to market faster, that's huge.
Yeah, and another thing, this is only in certain systems, but you can plant tree species. The one we do here is honey locust, where the sheep or whatever it is will actually kind of eat those pods that come out of it. So it can be another food source, right? So that's just like a one-off benefit, but it could be another kind of nutritional value for whatever livestock you have as well. But no, it's really, really beneficial. So that's a lot of different things for benefits. And, you have other kind of ecosystem services with it as well, sequestering carbon, things like that. So there's a lot to it. There's a lot of great benefits to silvopasture. I will say, just kind of as climate change becomes more of a thing, there's a lot of people that have recognized that silvopasture is a really great opportunity for the United States. And so all the more reason to talk about it, get people to understand it, know a little bit more about it, consider it. So it's definitely important.
Well, what are the challenges or downsides to silvopasture? Because there are so many benefits, but what are some of the things to keep in mind when implementing it?
Yeah, so there's a lot to consider with silvopasture. Of all the agroforestry practices, it can be tougher to adopt for kind of the economics of it, to be honest. It's a big investment to either thin your forest or take the time to plant trees into your pasture and in addition protect them while growing. It's a big time investment. It's a big dollar investment, but eventually your system will have its payoffs and eventually you'll likely earn more per acre with a silvopasture system than you would with a normal ranching system. But the years to break even are definitely a consideration. And then you have to be really intentional about setting the system up, or else you could damage the trees, you could damage the soil. It can be really tough to kind of work that system out and even know how you're going to do it, right? But there are a ton of resources to help with that, and which we can, of course, discuss later. But I guess just a couple of baseline considerations. You have to manage both the tree and livestock elements of this system, as we kind of already talked about. And there can be a learning curve with that if you're not familiar with it. So, what we usually tend to see is people either know trees, they know the forest, they know that kind of side of it, but they have no idea what to do with livestock. And so they have to learn that. Or on the flip side, and kind of what we see more here, they maybe have been managing hundreds of acres of cattle for, 40 years. They don't do anything with their back 40 or their back 40 of forest. And so that can be really hard as well. So when I did my research at Virginia Tech, we tried really hard to kind of hone in on why people would or would not adopt silvopasture. And so there's a lot that goes into that, but a downside that people don't really talk about is a social one. If your neighbor isn't doing it, why should you be the first one to test out that system? Yeah. That's what I focus on a lot, to be honest with you, is this social aspect of it. Luckily, it is getting more widespread. There is more federal money going towards this system, and the word is kind of finally getting out there. So that's a huge kind of bonus as well.
Well, like you said, too, it is a big learning curve. And so if your neighbors aren't doing it, if you don't have a concrete example of what it looks like.
Yeah. And kind of adding on to that, if you are kind of working or getting professional kind of assistance with something, right, whether it's technical or financial assistance from whatever government agency, it's really easy to just get a forester, right, if you're harvesting trees, or like an agricultural specialist if you're dealing with crops or your livestock or whatever. But you kind of have to work on getting both of those and integrating both of those with a silvopasture system, right? So it can be a little harder. Of course, there are people who know both. Yeah. And that's, again, getting more widespread, but it's another consideration as well.
Totally. And I guess one solution to that could be, if you're like, for example, if you have a forest that you want to thin and introduce livestock to, you could also rent it. You could rent it out to someone who has livestock, who knows how to deal with that. So that way you don't have to learn about that whole livestock element, because that is a huge thing. Or, if you have an orchard, you could do the same thing. Rent it out to a shepherd who has sheep, who just wants land to graze. That's more common out here in California, at least. But that could be one solution. Or just, learning how to manage both systems.
A lot of people have both, right? But for those people who do, they always, at least what I've heard, because again, I'm at heart like a social science researcher, what I've heard about this is there are people who do want to learn more about how to manage their woodland, or they want to do something with that pasture that they just use for hay or whatever it is. So there's a lot of solutions out there, and we just have to get creative, and we have to kind of lean into it a little bit in terms of, we know this is weird. We know it's an interesting system. We know it's not really widespread, but it's important. And I think it has a lot of potential.
And you can start small too. Like if you have cattle that you've been rotating and you just want to try out a little section of your farm, if you just want to try out planting, a little portion with trees, that's a good way to get started too. You can start small, as always, with anything.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
But another thing to think about, right, is the FSMA food safety guidelines, which you definitely have to think about if you're harvesting an edible crop from the trees, right? I know that there are regulations where you have to get animals out of your cropping system if you're going to be harvesting any edible crop from those trees. So if you have an orchard, like a walnut orchard or an apple orchard, and you have animals going through it, you have to get them out 90 days before your crop harvest. So that's something to consider too, just the timing of it, which can be so difficult.
Yeah, it's just another kind of point to that management system of it, right? And having a really well thought out plan with it.
Yeah, be intentional about it. So let's talk about establishing silvopasture for people who are interested in getting started with silvopasture. How do you go about doing it? And I know there are 3 general ways to establish silvopasture. So could you just walk us through what those ways are?
Yeah, sure. And I'll try not to ramble too much, but essentially, like you said, there's 3 different ways. So the first one is, you can have that forested land and you could thin it out, and then you can kind of put your livestock in there. The other way is kind of planting trees into your pasture. And then, like you said, there's planting pasture into orchards and running animals through. I don't know as much about that one as I do about the others. It's not as common kind of on the southeast anyways.
Yeah, it's much more common, I think.
that makes sense. And I'm sure we'll talk about this, but there are considerations to both, right? And kind of how into planting trees into pasture land or like thinning forest. So there are some key considerations you probably need to be aware of when you're first starting out and first planning those two systems.
Yeah. So if you, let's say you're a farmer who has a forest and you want to thin out your forest, what are the steps to thin out that forest? How do you choose which trees to thin? How do you choose which trees to leave? And how do you know how many trees to leave?
Yeah, great question. And it's going to kind of entirely depend both on your objectives and your already existing stand, but also kind of your region, what you already kind of have, right? So general rules of thumb, you want to have between 25 to 60% of your canopy density. And I know that's a large range, but that's to allow the light to infiltrate and for your pasture to grow. Another way to say that is there's maybe about 200 to 400 trees per acre that you would need. So another consideration to this, I guess, is depending on how dense your stand already is, that could mean doing one round of thinning, or it could mean doing 2 rounds of thinning, or if you have a really, really overstocked stand, it could mean 3 or 4, right? But normally it's about 1 or 2. So for those who aren't kind of the forestry people, I guess, there are stocking guides that you can look at and that you can consult to figure out, the optimum situation based on what your woodlands are. But again, you want to have it a little bit understocked because you want the pasture to start growing. But the other kind of consideration to this is you do want to keep those desirable trees, not necessarily like, oh, we want the biggest trees, but you want the ones that are desirable either because of the way they look, whether they're the really tall, straight ones for harvesting, or whether you want, certain species for non-timber forest products. So, nuts, fruits, things like that. And then to create the optimal environment, I guess, you want to make sure your remaining trees won't get stressed by that really heavy one-time thinning. So that's a big mistake that often gets made in implementing silvopasture systems is you want to do it real quick. You are like, okay, well, I know what basal area I need or what my stocking density is, and I'm just going to do one really quick, big thinning. But that leaves your trees really vulnerable. And so that could either be vulnerability from wind, from ice, from epicormic branching, which is when, it gets a lot of sunlight at one time and it starts to branch out and you get like really fuzzy trees, basically. So you don't want that either. So it's a huge consideration. Again, there's a lot of resources to kind of help. Foresters can do a forest management plan, things like that, just to make sure that you're doing it in the right way. And so, you can have the healthy trees to either harvest or harvest products from.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point, Delie. And it makes sense, like going about thinning in a slow, methodical way, because, you don't want to transition too quickly because trees will get stressed if suddenly they don't have the protection of an abundance of trees around them. So that makes total sense. So if you're going to implement silvopasture in the other way of planting trees into pasture, what are some considerations that people should have in mind if they go about silvopasture in that way?
For that one, I think a big consideration and a big struggle that people have with that is kind of trying to figure out, if you already have pasture, how you're going to shift that in the meantime while you're growing trees. And so, because you do have to keep them out when they're really little, because they can obviously damage them. And so you have to be really strategic about that. But it's totally possible. A lot of times people just fence them out of a certain part. And like you were saying, start small, right? And just plant a little patch, if you will, and then just get the tree species you want. And it's about your objectives, right? So if you want to, again, harvest fruit or harvest nuts or whatever it is, use those. If you eventually want to harvest for timber, like use the ones that are optimal in your area in order to kind of make that happen. So those are the big things. And of course, you want to start with like a soil test and things like that, just to see baseline what's already going on that patch, whatever you're kind of doing.
And it is really interesting, thinking about just protecting those trees because they need about like 4 to 5 years at minimum, right? Before you can put cattle, this huge animal into that pasture system with the trees. And that's a long time. So it can be tough to plan it out, knowing like, okay, I have to keep animals off this pasture for 4 to 5 years or put barriers around each tree for that long. It's a big thing to think about.
Yeah. And again, it's so dependent on what, with things like chickens, right? It's a little easier because of course they're smaller. And so you don't have as much of an issue, but with like goats, they're going to be jumping on those things. And, so anyways, it's always a consideration. And that is the hardest part to kind of implementing it on your pasture land. But a lot of people have these really kind of vast pastures or just a lot of acreage where they can maybe experiment with a small plot and see kind of what those benefits end up being, and then go from there. So again, it's all about creativity, working with kind of what works for your objectives, what works for your land, and then kind of starting small if you can.
And then, so once you've got your trees thinned out of your forest, or you've got your trees planted and established in your pasture, then you've got to think about the actual animal component, and you've got to think about how often you want to rotate your animals and what fencing looks like and all of that. And so that's a whole other ball game, right? And so what is your advice to someone about the animal component of silvopasture? Like, how often should we be rotating our animals? I guess it depends, right?
Yeah, of course. That's always going to be the answer, unfortunately. But yes, it is very dependent. If you are thinning out a woodland and then creating a silvopasture system, and say, you go through those thinnings, which in and of themselves is going to take a little bit of time, depending on kind of availability of foresters, which if it's right now, it's a little bit tough. But once you kind of get that started, get the thinnings, you then kind of have to wait for pasture to actually establish. And that could actually be pretty fast. But it just, again, depends on your region. So you, of course, have to wait for that. You also have to, and this would be part of the harvesting more than likely, but you have to kind of remove any woody debris so you can actually let the pasture establish itself. But yeah, you do kind of have to think about those things and the timeline for it. When you are doing it on the flip side, the pasture is already established, but you do have to kind of wait for those trees, as we kind of already mentioned. So that's another consideration. Once you actually get them on there, in terms of rotating cattle, it's dependent on your system. It depends on how many head of cattle you have or whatever it is, how big the system actually is. So those really small plots, you're going to have to rotate them really frequently. But I always just kind of say, follow guidelines for rotational grazing. We work a lot with NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, and, they give you guidelines and stuff for kind of rotational grazing based on your area. But I would just say, pay attention to the amount of feedstock that your animals have, the amount of pasture, and then how your trees are looking as well. So every farmer knows, like, they know their cattle, they know their trees, they know all of that kind of stuff inherently. So most people have that knowledge kind of already built in. It's just getting used to the system that you're kind of newly creating.
Right. Yeah. And so I guess the same principles of holistic management and adaptive grazing apply to silvopasture, where just keep those animals moving, keep them rotating, and don't let them back onto the same piece of land for a while. So yeah, I guess you're right. Those same principles apply, and it's just a matter of adapting to the increased shade of a silvopasture system.
Right. Yep. It's important for animals to have adequate feedstock. It's important that trees and soils aren't compacted by too much animal pressure. So just keeping those things in mind and just keeping going with it.
Yeah. The labor, required to keep those animals moving every day, that just involves fencing, right? Just having a good fencing infrastructure.
Yeah. Fencing is going to be the easiest way to kind of think through your silvopasture system, if you will. So knowing how many kind of rotational areas you need and having those fenced in, of course, things like horses and well-trained dogs, those things all make it easier in terms of actually moving them. Electric fences or mobile fences as well can also be really helpful.
So it seems like silvopasture makes a lot of sense.
I mean, we've talked about all the benefits, and yet silvopasture is still pretty uncommon here in the U.S., as you studied during your grad school research. So do you have numbers on how many people are actually implementing silvopasture in the U.S.?
I do, to an extent. It's a little hard to get the actual numbers, but I can give you a baseline. So I know that it's like almost 3,000. So it's like 2,725 farms of over 2 million farms are reported to practice either alley cropping or silvopasture. So they group them together in a lot of these surveys and census, data and stuff. So, but the idea is it's not many. It's like less than 1%, right?
Wow, that is not many at all. And why is it that adoption has remained so low? Despite silvopasture, it's not a new practice.
Yeah, it's actually a very old practice when you think about it. But at the end of the day, it's risk. And so it can feel really risky to implement something so different. It's been around for thousands of years, but it is kind of new again in the US, right? So it can be risky to implement something that feels so different. And then there's that social aspect again. when I did my survey for my master's research, which is kind of what I did on the barriers to adoption of silvopasture, there were some people that actually wrote in that their neighbors thought they were crazy for doing this. Yeah, and that can feel really hard to overcome. At the end of the day, trees are a longer term commitment than a crop is. And so that can be hard for folks as well.
That's true. They are a long-term commitment, and it takes years for them to grow and to actually reap the benefits that trees have in the system. And then also the investment. It takes years for farmers to break even. You can't harvest a timber tree for so many years. And so I'm sure that a lot of farmers get scared by that.
It is really scary. I think at the end of the day, economics absolutely play into it. You have to be able to make money. And I think, as I kind of alluded to in the beginning, silvopasture of all the kind of agroforestry systems is the hardest to kind of implement because it probably will be a little bit of money up front.
Yeah, it's a big investment to plant trees and then wait for those trees to grow, or to invest in, getting a crew in and thinning your forest. Like, that is a big upfront cost. And would you say that lack of knowledge about how these systems work is also a barrier to adoption? Like, just the fact that, it's not done often, and so people just haven't seen what it looks like in person?
Absolutely. So I always joke that it will start getting more widespread when people start doing it more. So, the more normal it becomes, basically, the more people will feel comfortable adopting this practice. And of course, more policy and government incentives will obviously help that. Because of kind of that lack of knowledge, either on one side or the other side or both sides, it can be really vastly helpful to either have cost share assistance or technical assistance, or both. The one that's most familiar to me, and I already alluded to this, but the Natural Resource Conservation Service, they were kind of the first ones to start putting silvopasture as a practice. And I think it was like 2011 or something like that. And so again, you can get cost share assistance with that. And I think that's hugely helpful. There are other kind of government incentives, of course, as you well know, but that's going to be your biggest go-to, I would say, just because, they do offer kind of that technical and financial assistance.
And there are more nowadays. Like here in California, we have the Healthy Soils program, which is a great program for farmers. And silvopasture is on the list of approved practices that you can get reimbursement for. So that's really great. Things are changing. It's becoming more of a thing.
Yeah. And another kind of place to do this, and they work kind of in concert with all of these kind of public agencies, but of course, universities, these extension services and places like that, they're more than happy to either do educational programs about silvopasture. If you're not sure and you want to just kind of listen in, there's a bunch of these extensions of universities that will, of course, do silvopasture demos. They'll do, just talks on it, or, some of them will even come out to your farm and help you understand your objectives and whether it'll work for you too.
NCAT has a lot of resources. We've got resources online, and then you can also just call us up. We have, sustainable ag specialists who are specialized in silvopasture, and we can just help you out and actually learn about the specifics of your farm too. And we can talk more about specific solutions for implementing silvopasture. But then also the National Agroforestry Center has so many great silvopasture resources, and the Center for Agroforestry has a lot of great online resources, great videos. So I do think that there are a lot of resources out there for farmers. We just got to try it out.
And it's all about just learning one thing and then going with it and seeing if you can learn more about it, right? So as you said, there's a bunch of, there's tutorials, there's stuff online that you can look at to just kind of get a baseline understanding of it. And if you want to do it, and then as silvopasture gets more widespread, maybe your neighbors start to do it, right? And you won't seem so crazy. You won't be the crazy neighbor who's doing silvopasture. Like, all of your neighbors will be doing silvopasture.
Oh, slowly but surely. So for people who do want to implement silvopasture and who feel like they want to take that leap, what would your advice be for the first steps that they should start to think about?
You alluded to it earlier, and I just think it's vastly. Take time, learn about it, contact all those kind of resources that we discussed, but start small. Understand what really makes sense for your farm, what really makes sense for you, your timeline, your budget, all of that kind of stuff, and just go from there. Like you said before, you can start with a small little, an acre or 2 acres or whatever it is. You can look and see, do my woodlands need to be managed? Like, is this an opportunity for me? Or, I have a lot of pasture and maybe this can work for me on the other end. And of course, with orchards, there's a whole different system. But yeah, I think that it's vastly important to just start small, learn what you can, and then just get technical assistance. There are so many people who know so much about this and can look at your farm and see what's best and work with you on your objectives. So that's what I would say.
Totally. It is possible to implement silvopasture. And I agree with you. I think it's going to be the future. I think that someday we're going to see a lot of farms with silvopasture, and the silvopasture practitioners are not going to be the crazy ones, just like you said.
I guess the kind of last consideration that I would say is of just you and yourself, right? Like, know what's important to you. So, when I was doing my study at Virginia Tech, a huge thing that really kind of came out of it that was maybe a little bit shocking to us is like the economics of it, or the budget for people, was not the biggest consideration. It was kind of making an environment that somebody wants to live in, right? And making an environment that's good for their pasture, or for their cattle, or for their chickens, or whatever it is. So it was really the environment around it that was more exciting for people in terms of silvopasture than the financial benefit of it. And of course, it's all a consideration, but I think it's kind of hugely helpful to know that it's all kind of important, right? And it's really about making an environment that's really kind of good for you and your family.
Yeah, and for the animals, like you said. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Delie, for your time. This has been so much fun. You have shared so much valuable information about silvopasture. I'm really excited to start seeing more of it.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I haven't had the opportunity to do a ton of silvopasture lately, so you've got like the itch on me again, and I'll have to start kind of getting back into that world. So thank you.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Additional information about this episode and related resources can be found at atra.ncat.org. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Voices from the Field wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Rich Myers. ATRA, Voices from the Field, is produced by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, headquartered in Butte, Montana. It's supported by the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service as part of NCAT's ATRA Sustainable Agriculture Program. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA or NCAT. We'll catch you again next week, and until then, keep on farming.